Awesome. And like I shared, you can use the chat feature throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, that feature is at the bottom of the application. Vladimir asked if you're going to be able to ask the slides. We're not going to share the slides, but we will share the recording of the webinar. And there will be some time for questions and answers at the end. Caitlin asked if there's audio. Yeah, Caitlin. Can everybody else hear me? Yeah, Caitlin, you may want to call in on your phone. Um, there's a number that I shared via the calendar invite a couple of minutes ago, and that can help you access the audio via your cell phone. Cool, well, let's jump right in. The presentation is going to be about 30 minutes long, and we'll use the remainder of the time for Q&A. A little bit about myself. So I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. Left for school, went down to North Carolina. When I was in high school and college, I was a DJ. And when thinking about what I wanted to do after my senior year, I really wanted to explore what I was experiencing as a DJ. My senior year, my DJ business started to grow. I had a couple DJs working on my behalf, and I wanted to learn some more about what I was hearing about startups and entrepreneurship. So I learned about Venture for America. I applied and thankfully received an offer to join. I spent my fellowship in New Orleans and worked at a startup in the food and beverage industry. I was in a sales role. After my fellowship came to a close, I knew two things: that I wanted to stay in New Orleans as well as continue to learn how to sell. And I did that at a second startup, worked there for about 2 years until last spring when I wanted to move closer to home. And when I did move back to Columbus, Ohio, which is a VFA city, also my hometown, I joined the Venture for America team as a recruiter. And so with today's presentation, we're going to first start off with Venture for America's mission and an overview of the program. We are going to then jump into VFA Match, which is where you find your job as an incoming VFA fellow. We're then going to jump into Training Camp, which is the experience that fellows go through before moving to their cities. It's a 5-week experience in Detroit, Michigan. We're going to talk about life as a fellow, as well as life as an alum. And then we are going to chat about Launch. And Launch is the team internally at VFA that provides entrepreneurial support to our fellows who are starting a business, whether they are in the first couple of stages of starting a business or they're hiring people, generating revenue, and raising fundraising rounds. And last but not least, 30 minutes on Q&A. So first, let's jump into the mission and an overview of VFA. So I'm going to read this aloud because it's really important, and I will tell you why. Venture for America is creating economic opportunity in American cities by mobilizing the next generation of entrepreneurs and equipping them with the skills and resources they need to create jobs. If we break this down, you all are the next generation of entrepreneurs. We want to help you create jobs, start businesses, learn to become startup leaders. And in order to do so, we're going to connect you with the skills, the resources, and the community to help you along the way. You'll see here that we work in American cities. In fact, there's 14 cities that we work in. And so we're going to go over those cities. But when applying to VFA, I would highly recommend you dig into our mission, you dig into our cities, you dig into the skills and the resources that we provide to fellows, and you dig into why we do this, create jobs. The reason why is there's a lot of different ways to break into entrepreneurship and tech, and there are 200 spots that we're projecting in the class of 2020. Those spots are reserved for people who can articulate why VFA is the next best step in their career. And usually people who can articulate that are people who have read about our mission, researched our mission, and can articulate their own story in alignment with our mission. So like I mentioned, we work in American cities. In fact, there's 14, and they're predominantly along the East Coast, the Midwest, and the Southeast. Why did we pick these cities? These cities have a couple of things in common. They all have growing entrepreneurial ecosystems, meaning that there is a founder in Birmingham, in Detroit, in Baltimore, who is building a company and it's going somewhere. A lot of these founders in these cities struggle to attract talented people like you and me to come to Philadelphia, Kansas City, or Miami to work in a startup, because when we all think startups, we traditionally think about the hubs, New York, San Francisco, Austin, Boston. And so we focus on these cities because we know that there's opportunities for young people who want to grind, who want to hustle, who want to become leaders at startups, who want to learn what it's like to build a company. And we know that there's opportunities for those people at startups that are headed north. So in your application, don't say anything about San Francisco, nothing about New York. You should think about how you could live in one of these cities over the next 2 years and why that opportunity is appealing to you, because these are the 14 cities that you have an opportunity to work in. So let's dig into our application process. And before we do so, I just want to talk about eligibility. So in order to apply to VFA, you must be a US citizen, a permanent resident, or a DACA holder, and you must have earned your undergraduate degree by spring 2020, meaning next spring, and or graduated with your first undergraduate degree by spring 2017. So in short, you graduate between 2017 and 2020, and you do not require sponsorship to work in the United States. If you have questions about that, you should email me, and I will have my email at the end of the presentation. So the first step of the application is the activity section. I saw some of you have already submitted this. In short, we want to figure out who you are, basic contact information. You'll upload your resume to this portion of the application, and you'll talk about your impact. You'll talk about times where you showed value. Some things that are not required. You do not need to be an entrepreneur already. You do not have to have started something already. You don't need to know how to code. Things that are required, you need to be able to articulate a time when you made an impact on an organization, when you added value to a student group, a community organization, a part-time job, a full-time job that you had. So this section is about articulating impact and value. Next, there's 2 essays. These essays are rooted in 2 different concepts. The first is, why is VFA the next best step in your career? The second is practicing how you would pitch yourself to a startup. This is one of my favorite parts of the application, because in reality, this is what our whole application is built on. You know, you could go get a startup job anywhere, but why do you want to be a VFA fellow? What specific parts of the program make this the next best step in your career? Secondly, yeah, you're a VFA fellow, but we can't just want you in our program. You have to be able to perform at a startup every single day. That's the core of the fellowship. And in order to work at a startup, you have to be able to pitch yourself to a startup. And so once again, how do you articulate your impact with past organizations and experiences and translate that into skills that are valuable at a startup? And then the video interview. This is a classic interview that you've had elsewhere through a startup lens. We ask you about obstacles and barriers that you have overcome in order to assess what you're going to do when you get to a startup and it's also hard. And it's going to be hard. So this is a classic interview. It's going to be with a fellow, an alum, or a VFA team member. And then lastly, selection day. So for the purposes of this webinar, if you apply to deadline 3, which is November the 21st, your selection day will be in January, and it will be in New Orleans or it will be in Philadelphia, 2 of our VFA cities. I would highly recommend applying to this deadline. Our last and final deadline is January the 31st. The reason why I'd recommend applying to this deadline is you get in January, and you have from January to April to prepare for match. If you apply in January, you get in March, and then match is the next month, and your time for onboarding is very short. If you have questions about the application process, I just linked a link in the chat feature. Feel free to click on it. All right, what do we look for in the application? I saw some questions come through here on Splash about this. First, mission alignment. You have to do your homework. You have to talk about our mission. We're a nonprofit. Nonprofits care about their mission. You need to be able to tell your story about why VFA is the next best step in your career. Like I said, you can get a startup job in any city. Why do it through VFA? The core components of our mission is that we want fellows who want to work at a for-profit startup in one of our cities with the goal of either becoming a leader at that startup and or a founder. These are the only 2 things we focus on. If you're not interested in being a startup leader or a founder, you are in the wrong place. If you are interested in either or both of those opportunities, you are in the right space, and let's keep going. Ability to contribute. Like I said, what are you going to do to add value at a startup? Let's give an example here. I'm a salesperson. So if I was pitching myself to a sales role, I would think about the skills that were required in a sales role. One skill is being organized. So when pitching myself for this sales role, I would think about a time when I was organized. I would articulate the action. For example, when I was the president of this club, attendance was low. We didn't have any membership. I developed a plan to recruit underclassmen. Through developing this plan, staying organized, and following up with potential applicants or people to join my club, we increased our club participation from 10 people to 30 people in 1 year. If you can't articulate your skills in that same framework, it's hard for an employer to think about how you're going to plug into their organization. Articulate the context, what you did, the skill you're demonstrating, and quantify the impact of your action. And lastly, character. So when thinking about this, think about characteristics that are important for working at a startup, being an entrepreneur, being a good startup employee. This might be positivity, grit, integrity, resilience. These are all things that help you when it's really hard and things that we look for in our application. Let's jump into match. So the match process. First and foremost, we're not going to place you at a startup, but we are going to give you a platform to pitch startups, and startups are going to pitch you. Last year, there were nearly 600 opportunities on Match, and there were 200 fellows in the class of 2019. Match begins in April of 2020 for those who joined the class of 2020. And there's a disclaimer here. So VFA is not a magic wand. It's unlikely for us to be able to give you your preferences for industry, location, and role. Like I can't get you a sales role in Baltimore in the education industry, because even if that opportunity exists, it doesn't guarantee that they are going to hire you. And so there's a lot of different ways that we coach you on keeping wide preferences in getting to your goal of being a leader at a startup and or a founder. And so I always like to give this tidbit to applicants, and it's the same advice that was given to me. You should look for an opportunity where you can make an impact every day, where you feel like you can bring your full self to work and there's a sense of camaraderie on the team. Lastly, look for a leader who's going to treat you as an apprentice and show you the ropes about how it feels and what goes into building a business. If you look for those 3 characteristics and don't just focus on industry, role, and city, and this goes for VFA and non-VFA, you will find an opportunity that is a good fit for you. I followed that person's advice and I found a great role for myself. And lastly, match is a time intensive process. It's time intensive to get into VFA. And then once you're in VFA, you got to put more time in. So you got to do your homework now and allocate time once match occurs. I was a senior once. I know what April through June feels like to be a senior. Your friends are going to be having a ball and you're going to be having a ball too, but you have to allocate time for match. So this is the end of your year, but it's the beginning of your professional career. And you got to allocate time. And it's a reality that with the startup hiring process, that you're going to be looking for a job in April and June, and they want you to start the next day, but you have until August to work at that company. And we'll get into that timeline a little bit more. So here are some resources that we provide to our fellows. These would be some perks of becoming a VFA fellow and finding a startup job through us rather than doing it on your own. So first, we have Match, which is a private online job portal. It's exclusively for incoming fellows. Older fellows like myself don't get to come in there and take jobs for you. Number 2, we will help you with those preferences that I talked about, with resume reviews and interview coaching prior to you jumping on Match. That's why I said it's better to apply to this November deadline, so you get in January, and then you can have from January until April to take advantage of this resource. Number 3, we have job fairs. So last year, we had 3 job fairs. They were regional. They were in Cleveland, Baltimore, and Birmingham, and startups from the region descended upon these cities to hire people like you. You can think of this as speed dating startup interview style. So you'll jump from startup to startup. Startups will jump from fellow to fellow, seeing if there's mutual interest based on the problem they're solving, their team, their city, and so on. Job fairs are also a great opportunity to get to a VFA city, especially one that you haven't gone to, start interacting with fellows and catching the vibe to see if it's a place where you'd like to spend at least the next 2 years of your life. And lastly, we will make direct introductions to you. So if we know that you are looking for a sales role at an education company in Baltimore, based on all 3 of those preferences, when we find opportunities that could be appealing to you, we will directly introduce you to companies when there's mutual interest, so you can kind of skip the pitch process. I want to jump into industries a little bit with companies in Match. So most of our startups are for-profit companies. I know that as millennials, and I definitely subscribe to this as well, we want to save the world. We want to work at nonprofits. We want to become teachers. VFA is not really the place for that because the vast majority of our companies are for-profit entities. If you are interested in nonprofits, saving the world, wanting to become a teacher, please answer that question, ask that question at the end, because this is a view that I hold as well. Like if I could be a teacher every day, K-12 education teacher, I'd be down. But the reality is you are going to be going to work at a for-profit company every single day for at least 2 years. 75% of our companies are for-profit. 10% are nonprofit. The remainder are a mix of support organizations, whether they're VCs or incubators. The hard to categorize section, a lot of in there is like co-working spaces and things along those lines. So 10% nonprofits, 1% social enterprises. Let's chat during Q&A if something in terms of impacting the world is in your career goals. And here are the industries. So a lot are in software and tech. However, we do have startups that are in education, healthcare, food and beverage, as well as health and wellness. I'm linking a page in the chat where you can see where fellows have worked in the past. It's not a guarantee that these companies will be hiring again or this year, but it'll give you a sample of companies that are solving certain problems. Cool. Let's jump into training camp. So as match finishes in late June, training camp gears up in July. It's a month long, it's in Detroit. Housing, food, and transportation to and from training camp is covered. You are responsible for providing money for your social activities during the evenings and nights. So this is an all-day experience. You can think of formal activities taking place from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. There are social opportunities afterwards. These social opportunities, they range from exploring Detroit, getting to know local fellows, traveling regionally, and as well as doing things that 20-year-olds, 20-somethings do. It's very difficult to work or finish your classes alongside training camp. So if you have a logistics question about how to balance training camp with something else you have to do, let me know. But what goes on during training camp? So first, we have hard and soft skill workshops throughout the entire uh, training. Organizations like Boston Consulting Group, IDEO, Y Combinator come and execute these workshops. Secondly, we really like to cultivate an entrepreneurial mindset. What are you going to do when you're working at your startup, as well as what you can do when building your own company? So we have challenges that cultivate this mindset. There's a website challenge where you build a website in a week for a local Detroit business. IDEO talks about going from the from the idea stage to the prototype stage, and we also working on marketing as well as business plan strategies and presenting those strategies to a panel of judges. Last and certainly not least, training camp is about community. We have 5 core values at VFA. We call them our credo. We share personal stories about the credo throughout training camp, and it's a great opportunity to get to know your peers. I would highly recommend you look up at the credo. It's aligned with our mission, and you talk about that in the application if you are interested in the credo. There's 1,000 VFA fellows who have gone through this experience to date, including myself. You all will make it 1,200. That's a very tight-knit community. If you say to somebody, hey, I'm New Orleans 2014, or I'm Kansas City 2020, they're gonna know what you're talking about, and there's a shared experience there. These are your future roommates, your future co-founders, lifelong friends, mentors, potentially employers. I'm really excited to see what the VFA community accomplishes 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, because we're only 1,200 deep, and you all would be the 8th class of VFA fellows. Let's talk about life as a fellow. So you will move to one of 14 VFA cities to begin work at that startup that you get hired at during match in August or September of 2020. So most of the fellowship is working 9 to 5 at that startup. This is a great opportunity to learn on someone else's dime. Yes, you could go out and start a business right now, but you could also learn a lot of painful and valuable lessons from watching someone else build. I personally got to see my company grow from 40 employees to 100 employees, grow from 10 cities to 30 cities. Being a part of that kind of growth came with some ups and downs that I've applied to future jobs, or jobs in between now and then, as well as I will apply to when I build my own company in the future. We have opportunities for ongoing professional development and mentorship. There are opportunities in your city. There's opportunities regionally among VFA cities, and we also come together as fellows and alumni nationally for these opportunities as well. We have a mentorship portal where you can jump on there and find formal mentors based on interests, based on industries, and we have ongoing professional development throughout your fellowship and afterwards. And lastly, you get an opportunity to live in this city. You know, you're not just working. During my fellowship, I planned an entrepreneurship conference in New Orleans. I mentored with a nonprofit for boys who had lost their dads to death or imprisonment. Participated in intramural sports leagues weekly. And some of my peers in New Orleans and elsewhere actually purchased homes and decided to live in their cities or commit to their cities for the long term. So there's a lot of different ways to get involved in your city outside of your 9 to 5. But what about after VFA? I saw some questions come through about alumni. So 13% of our alumni are working full-time on their companies. 30% of alumni have attempted to start a business with VFA. So keeping it real, startups go under. But 13% of our alumni are working on their businesses today through VFA. Secondly, there's the startup leadership path. The idea is that at the end of your fellowship, you will identify as a leader at the startup that you work at. An example here is Alex from the class of 2013. He started as an entry-level employee at his startup and is now the COO 5 years later. 60% of our alumni are identifying as startup leaders and maintaining employment at their startup or another startup in the ecosystem. And there are also fellows who decide to go to larger tech firms or established organizations. Molly Adair is in my class, 2014. She worked at Focal Upright Furniture, was an ergonomics furniture company, and then developed her UX design skills, and then moved to Seattle to live with her boyfriend, and now works at Amazon Web Services. So about 15% of our alumni are working at larger, more established companies. And lastly, we're going to jump into our launch resources before turning it over to the Q&A. When trying to start a company, VFA has several resources to provide you. First, we have quarterly hackathons with prize money. We call these the validation challenge. What happens here is when you have an idea, the first step is not to start working on that idea, it's to validate your idea. Do you have a market? Does your product fix a problem with that market? And so you work through this challenge with your peers locally and regionally. You then pitch to a virtual panel, and the winners of this competition receive prize money to take the next step with their venture. Secondly, one of the flagship programs of the launch team is the Accelerator. The Accelerator is currently occurring in Cleveland, Ohio, 4 months, all expense paid, every day, programming, mentorship, housing, and food provided for you. And the goal of the Accelerator is to accomplish an objective, whether that is generating your first dollar, finding your first customer, raising a round of financing. Whatever that objective that you set with the entrepreneurship and launch team at the beginning of the Accelerator, that's what you're going to work towards your entire Accelerator experience. And this Accelerator's in Cleveland this year. It's also been in Detroit. It's also been in Philadelphia, based on cities that fundraise money. The Accelerator will change. I saw a question come through. I'm going to answer it at the end because we're almost to Q&A. Lastly, VFA invests in fellows. Annually, VFA has invested up to $1.4 million across all of our different fundraising opportunities, whether it's through the hackathons, the Accelerator, and also when VFA fellows and alumni are raising money for their businesses outside of this programming, VFA can participate in your fundraising round. Lastly, we're going to jump into the Q&A, but a couple of housekeeping items before we do. So first, I want to know if you got what you wanted. So alongside the recording, I'm going to send out a survey. The deal here is that if you help me improve, I'm going to help you improve. So if you want help with your application, throw me some feedback on the survey. Lastly, stay in touch. Happy to be a resource for y'all throughout the application process alongside my colleagues on the recruitment team. My email is the letter J, the letter R @ventureforamerica.org. And lastly, you should apply not by October 21st, but November 21st. Sorry for the typo. That's the third deadline of 4. So let's jump into the Q&A. I saw one come through, and feel free to jump in the chat feature if you have other questions. So as far as eligibility goes, if you are, the key is that we cannot provide sponsorship to work in the US. So the shorthand for that is being a US citizen, a permanent resident, or a DACA holder. VFA is not going to pay you. The startup is going to pay you, and I'm happy to get into salary. And so because of that, the startup would have to pay for sponsorship. Startups tend to be resource constrained and tend to not be able to afford sponsorship, which is why we require that our applicants are US citizens, permanent residents, and or DACA holders. If you have any questions about that, that I was unable to answer, please DM me so that we can knock that out. So let the questions rip. I'm going to kind of group these by topic so that we're kind of talking about things all at once. So y'all shared some questions via Splash when you signed up, and some broad categories that were shared were application related questions, the nuts and bolts of cost and salary. So I'm just going to call that $, questions about the program itself, and then questions about launch. So as I answer some of these questions that came through, I'm going to read yours and kind of group them along the way. So there was a question about it being a disadvantage to not having prior entrepreneurial experience. Like I shared, it's more about articulating your impact at past organizations or projects. It doesn't have to be at a startup. It could be with a club. It could be with a community service project that you worked on. For those who are not seniors or not eligible to apply, my advice is to start something or to get an internship at a startup. When thinking about starting something, it doesn't have to be a business, but it could be a club, it could be a community service project. The fundamentals of starting something are the same. You got to validate your idea, recruit people to join your crazy idea, stay organized, and make an impact and value. Would also recommend interning at a startup, whether it's during the semester where you have some costs covered, or during the summer when you might be looking at other internships. Some other questions that were listed about the application. So folks asked about letters of recommendation. We don't need letters of recommendation. However, we will ask for references when you get to selection day. And so you could use any people that you would use for a letter of recommendation at that time. There were some questions about what traits do we see as most successful in this career path, as well as the qualities that contribute to success in the program. I had that slide about what we look for. And so I'll let you refer back to that for those questions. However, the bottom line with VFA, y'all, is that you want to become a leader at a startup and or a founder. And if you can tell your story about how VFA is the next best step in your career, as well as the value that you can make at a startup, this is for you. It's just about articulating that in written form, in verbal form, in person, and virtually throughout the application. But if you really take the time to do your research, watch the webinars, do your homework, dig into our website, tell your story, make sure there's no typos in that. There's a spot reserved for you. Somebody asked about acceptance rate. I don't think that matters. This isn't getting into a highly selective school or an Ivy League school where you're thinking about your SAT score. This is about your career goals and articulating them. So tell your story, and we look forward to hearing it. Okay, here. I see some coming through here about salary. Like I said, if you have questions about eligibility, please email me. So let's get into match and salary. First, salary. So I'm answering your question, Ben. Like I said, the startup is going to pay you, VFA will not. The median salary for the class of 2019 was $47,000. Let's dig into what that means. First, we're talking about the median, not the average. So if you line everybody up from the person who got paid the least to the person who got paid the most, the person in the middle made 47K, which means there are a bunch of people that made 47K. We picked the median rather than the average because salespeople and software engineers tend to get paid at the upper end of the spectrum. The highest paid person at any organization is usually a salesperson. They often get paid more than the CEO. And software engineers, there's a shortage of them everywhere, so people throw money at them. The minimum that VFA fellows are paid is $38,500. But like I said, the median was 47K. Let's talk about the context around 47K. So 47K in New York, San Francisco, Boston, Austin, DC is scary. Might not be able to make rent. 47K in New Orleans, Detroit, Baltimore is livable. And if you have questions about your specific socioeconomic situation, please reach out to me. I'll give you some ballpark numbers. In New Orleans, I had friends that were getting that were paying between $500 and $1,000 for rent. Most VFA fellows live with other VFA fellows for the camaraderie, as well as to save on costs. Finding $600, $700 places to live in these cities is quite reasonable to find, which is another reason why we've chosen to work in them. I also like to think about cost of living and quality of life in terms of the cost of a beer. And so I get scared going to big cities and dropping like $10, $12, $15 for a beverage. In VFA cities, you're paying $5, $6, $7, $8 for a beverage. So in terms of rent, in terms of beer, it's affordable to live in these cities. I understand that sometimes people got to send money home to their family. People also have college debt. And so I'm happy to chat with you offline if you really want to dig into your socioeconomic situation and if this is affordable for you. VFA, we pride ourselves on being an on-ramp to entrepreneurship. And so if there are barriers to you becoming a VFA fellow that are socioeconomic, we want to hear about them so we can support you. In my role, I focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which means that people who identify based on their race, their gender, their sexuality, or their socioeconomics, I'm a point of contact to make sure that you're included in this application process, as well as this community. So please reach out to me. I'm an advocate for you. Let's see here. Is there a cost to joining VFA? No. Traditionally, you will pay to get to selection day. We do offer stipends for travel. Like I said, the social activities during training camp are on you, but the food, the beverage, the transportation to and from training camp is on us. Moving expenses would traditionally be on the fellow. However, fellows do negotiate for moving expenses when they're negotiating their salary during match. That's a great question that you should ask during match when you're getting prepared to negotiate. During match, you'll get a coach like me, and that's like something you can ask me about. Like, hey, I got this offer from company X. They gave me Y amount. What can I go back to them with? Like, if they're not going to pay me more, can I ask for my healthcare moving from this level to this level, or moving expenses, equity, getting my cell phone or my gym taken care of? Like, we can brainstorm on those types of things. All in all, VFA covers quite a bit to get to VFA obligated activities. If there's an obstacle to you becoming a fellow, socioeconomic or otherwise, financial or otherwise, tell us so that we can help you. If you don't tell us, we can't help you. So be transparent with us, trust us. We keep all of that confidential, and we want you to become VFA fellows. So let us know how we can help. There were some cool last thing on salary that I've seen thus far is, do salaries differ by location? They differ by the company. So company by company, you'll negotiate your salary with. But like I said, the minimum was 38 and a half. The median was 47,000, excuse me. Some people got paid more. Some people got paid less than that median. Happy to dig into that with anybody. There were some questions about industry. On the private equity side, I don't recall a private equity firm specifically. That doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. If you go to the VFA website, I linked a link here where fellows work. You can see companies by industry. Disclaimer about a couple of industries. So if you are interested in working in venture capital, private equity, as well as like green technology, like the environmental space, VFA is not the most direct way to get to those opportunities. Yes, there are companies that work in those industries, but obviously those are popular industries. And this isn't like a venture capital program. It's focused on for-profit startups. So venture capital and private equity are support organizations to the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And we do partner with businesses that are in that space in certain cities, but they're limited and they're popular. And so if that is your number one career goal, like if I don't get a job at a VC or a private equity firm, I want to quit VFA, then you really shouldn't apply, because we can't guarantee you that. And that gets into the preferences that I was talking about earlier, like being honed in on one industry, make or break it. You really need to ask yourself and ask me as a recruiter in the VFA team, are there opportunities in this space? So there's more direct ways to get into VC and private equity. When it comes to green technology, we don't have a lot of companies in those spaces. Also, if you're an engineer and want to maintain your status or your role as an engineer, like a mechanical, chemical, biomedical engineer, a lot of times startups in the engineering space don't hire entry-level employees. They'll hire somebody with like a master's degree or a PhD. So we don't have a lot of roles outside of software engineering, although there are a few. The advice that we always give to engineers is that if you want to pick up another skill set, like you want to become a salesperson, an operator, a marketer, VFA is a great opportunity. One reason why you studied engineering is probably because it's hard, it's respected, it gives you a skill set. Everybody on the planet respects an engineer. And so if you say, hey, I was an engineer, but I want to become a salesperson, and this is my skill set, and this is how it translates to becoming a salesperson, you're going to be all right. So I'm going to talk some more about industry. I know Dylan jumped in early about social entrepreneurship. And Caitlin asked about B Corps and social enterprises. So I'm going to get into this concept of kind of like nonprofit. And I say saving the world, and I don't mean to be like a douche about that, because I want to save the world as well. This is the model for VFA. So you are going to work at a startup and you are going to gain some skills. And at the end of the fellowship, you can stay at that startup, or you could go to another startup. You could go to a big tech firm. You could go to grad school, or you could start a business of your own. For me, like I'm really passionate about K-12 education. In fact, I applied to TFA and I applied to VFA, and I was more pumped on VFA, so I took VFA. No shot at TFA. I'm interested in being a K-12 education teacher. Say, for example, I'm interested in the education space. Yes, I could work at a startup in the education space. Yes, I could work at a nonprofit. Yes, I could work at a social enterprise. However, industry is not the only way to get the skills and experiences that you need to take the next best step in your career. So if you're interested in the social entrepreneurial nonprofit save the world sphere, you can work at a for-profit business and or a business that's outside of that industry and still get to where you want to be at the end of the fellowship. If that didn't answer your question, please jump in. I'd also like to add that a lot of folks in our generation want to make a social impact, but the reality is our country operates within capitalism and you have to make money. And so I personally think about this in terms of balancing my social interests and my like need to make money for myself and my family for the present and the long term. I often say to fellows, focus on making money from 9 to 5, and focus on making a community impact from 5 to 9. Like I said, I mentored in New Orleans, and back here in Columbus, I'm starting a mentorship program at my high school. So like I'm aligned with you, but think creatively about how you can work in an industry that's outside of your industry of choice, as well as at a for-profit enterprise that may or may not be a social enterprise, to get to your career goals. And if you want to launch a social enterprise at the end of VFA, good. But I'm just trying to like encourage you to be flexible and to like think about the program in terms of how it's set up, because there aren't a lot of social enterprises that are hiring through VFA. Let's see here. So I got some more questions about application. So you have to have graduated by May 2020 in order to be eligible. If you have to like work over this or take classes over the summer, it would conflict with training camp, unfortunately, and I think that would be very difficult. You should follow up with me directly. You would not be able to like finish your fall semester and then do VFA. It's pretty much cut and dry. You're graduating in May 2020. Let me know if you have additional questions about that. DM me via email. There were some questions about healthcare benefits. So the startup is required to provide healthcare benefits alongside that minimum salary, and a lot of the startups pay more. And on the minimum salary, like if one startup lowballs you and you get an offer from the other one, you can negotiate. And you can blatantly say like, hey, this startup is giving me X amount. Why should I accept Y amount? So we'll coach you through that negotiation. There was a question about finding a place to live. Good question logistically. So VFA does not support helping fellows find places to live. Fellows organize that on their own. So when I was at training camp, we got together as New Orleans fellows. We were like, oh, like you're going to New Orleans. What are your living preferences? Do you want to live with all people of your same gender? Are you loud? Are you quiet? Are you a party animal? Are you a studier? And we self-organized based on those preferences. Like there was a time where I was going to live with 3 of my women identifying fellows. Our house didn't end up working out for finding a 4-person house. So I went with another fellow who ended up being one of my best friends and roommates. Logistically, how do you find a house when you're at training camp? So how this usually goes is you say, hey, when fellows come to training camp from your city, you'll get to know them. You'll also get added to the group me during training camp. And so you'll say things like, hey, we're looking at this house in X neighborhood in New Orleans. Can someone come by, drop by and look at it for us? And so alumni like went by and they were like, hey, like the house is falling apart or the appliances are nice. Hey, looked at it on the map. Like that's not a safe neighborhood. That's an up and coming neighborhood. You'd really like it. Alumni will help you. Alumni did it for us. And younger fellows than me will do it for you. So don't worry about housing. All of that gets handled during training camp. So there was a question from Vishal about, he said it was mentioned earlier that VFA supports alum who start their own businesses. Is that support contingent on whether the founder is building the business in a VFA city, or can it be anywhere? So after the fellowship, Vishal, you can depart from your VFA city. There are large communities of VFA fellows in San Francisco, in New York, of course, and they've kind of formed like their own like alumni cohorts or communities. Some of them are building companies in those markets. And so VFA will support you for life as a founder and as an entrepreneur. It doesn't have to be in a VFA city, although that does align with the mission, but it's about your journey. It's not about VFA. Someone asked about resources available to browse through. Yeah, so if you go to the VFA website, there's a section called Office Hours. There's also a blog. You can also, the Office Hours is like our Medium blog. Um, there's also a book called Everything Startups that you get if you sign up for our mailing list. And I think it's like 40, 50 pages of like all that we've learned about startups over the 8 years that we've been operating. Let's see, what else do we have here? Yeah, Ryan, fellows do get multiple offers during match. I ended up getting, I think, 3 offers, 2 in Detroit, 1 in New Orleans, and I picked the one in New Orleans because it was growing the fastest. Um, Ryan also asked why I chose New Orleans. It was definitely company based. Like, it's easy for the guy that was at Mardi Gras and living in New Orleans in the warmth to say like it was about company, but it truly was. I was looking very hard at 2 startups in Detroit that were in the education technology space. At the time, Andrew Yang was the CEO of VFA. He's the founder of Venture for America. And I actually sent him a text, got on the phone with him, and asked him about which offer I should take. I said, hey, these 2 opportunities are in ed tech in Detroit. You know, I'm a Midwest kid. I'm interested in the K-12 education space. Like, I feel like I should take those offers. Like, they're aligned with like how I, see my journey. But then I told him about the company in New Orleans in the food and beverage space and how quickly it was growing and how I was just like interested in the problem that they were solving. So he said that when you have an opportunity to get on a rocket ship, you don't ask where your seat is, you get on. And so I took that advice and accepted the opportunity in New Orleans, and don't regret it. I learned a ton. Someone asked about the scope of mentorship. Is it acceptable to have a mentor in the state different than you're assigned for the fellowship? Absolutely. I mean, mentorship will take place at your own startup. Like, you'll develop relationships with people who are more mature than you, and a mentorship relationship could commence. When I was in New Orleans, I reached out to people who are like VP of sales at startups. It was like a great way to just reach out and be like, hey, I'm one of few people at company X. Like, can I grab you for some coffee and like ask you about your technology that you use with your sales process? And then there's the formal mentorship portal, which is called VFA Connect. So mentorship can take place in a lot of ways. Can I give an example of how to be creative when you are outside of your industry? You can continue to read about your industry. You could write content for that industry online to demonstrate that you're a thought leader or an expert in that space. You could look for opportunities outside of your 9 to 5 to develop that interest. A lot of different ways. Just stay up to date on what's going on in your industry. What happens if the startup you join goes under? So there's 2 minutes left and we're at an hour. What time we got here? I want to respect y'all's time. 5:28. So we're going to go until 5:35 because we started at 5:25. I'll tell you your story. So the answer to your question, if your startup goes under, VFA's got your back. The reality is startups go under. If you start your own business, your startup could go under. The startup that you work at through VFA could go under. True story, that rocket ship that I worked at in New Orleans went bankrupt. This happened about 20 months into my fellowship. So it was about like March, April of 2016. My fellowship was about to come to a close. Why did it go under? And then what did VFA do to show that it had my back? We grew way too fast. We were throwing people and money at problems rather than building processes and systems. Our financial model and business model weren't in alignment with what we were doing. Like, we were behaving outside of our business model and financial model. So we had more money going out than going in. We also had 5 co-founders, and there were just a lot of cooks in the kitchen. What did VFA do to have my back? So the day that the company went under, somebody from VFA reached out to me via text, asked me if I wanted to chat. They knew because an older fellow worked there, reached out. And so if your company does go under, the first thing you got to do is tell somebody at headquarters. We have this email. I'm not going to give it to you because I don't want you to email it, but when you become a fellow, you can email it and it goes out to the entire VFA team. And like people will just respond if it's appropriate for them to respond. So I would recommend that you email that email if your company goes under. VFA asked me if I was cool financially, if I needed help finding a job. The reality was, after 20 months of living in New Orleans, my network was fairly strong in New Orleans. So I spent the next couple of weeks, I had a couple $1,000 saved up. I was in a sales role, so I had a little bit of a cushion. I took a little bit of time off, a couple of weeks. I attended an entrepreneurship conference in New Orleans where I was networking. I went around to the growing tech companies in the city. And I think the next thing that I share is really important and I think really characteristic of these cities. The number one thing that I heard from people when I was going from startup to startup is just don't leave New Orleans. You know, I was talking about going to work at a startup in New York, and people were like, nah, man, like we need you down here. And like, even if you don't come and like work at our startup, we need you in New Orleans. And I think that really speaks to the impact that you make when you decide to become a VFA fellow, when you decide to move to one of these cities and work at a startup. You know, these cities are struggling to attract people like you and me, and these companies are as well. And you can really make an impact at these startups and then in culmination in the city. So, you know, I networked at that conference. I took a couple of opportunities that VFA floated my way. VFA fellows that were local, my roommate, my buddies that I played basketball with, like fellows across identities, were like trying to hook me up with like part-time gigs at at their companies. Like, do you just need hourly work? So all in all, VFA locally, the New Orleans community, and VFA nationally had my back. And when thinking about, you know, my class only had 100 fellows in 2014. How many of those companies went under? I would guess like 5 of 100. Some of them were growing slowly, but and some of them grew very fast. Some were acquired. But I would guess that like 5 companies went under during my fellowship, and that's a guess. It doesn't happen as often as startups outside of VFA might go under, because we source these companies and we live in these cities. So we pick startups that are growing as well as who have leaders that are well known in the community. But it's a reality. You know, my startup that I was working at was growing and had strong leadership as well, but it went under. Caroline asked about captions. I'm not quite sure how to do that, Caroline, but I am going to send out a recording so you can catch the end of this since you're in class. Julia asked about startup work hours. I say 9 to 5. Julia, I think the honest answer is it depends on the startup. I think it also, like startups, this is not the place to go if you're not wanting to put in the hard work. Like there was times where I worked at nights, there were times that I worked on weekends, because you're building a company, like you're building the airplane while flying it. And that's tough to do. So I'm not quite sure what fellows report as far as the 9 to 5, but expect to put in some hours. What did you bring to New Orleans that kept you there as opposed to Baltimore? Can you rephrase your question for me? We got about a minute left, and I want to see if there's anybody else who asked questions that I missed. New Orleans is more popular. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like industry or like city, like yeah, you can pick a popular city like New Orleans or Miami or Philly. These are all popular cities because fellows want to have fun. But the reality is, like, this fellowship isn't about having fun. It's about becoming a leader at a startup and or a founder. And so, like, you can have a ton of fun in New Orleans, but not be at a job where you're making an impact, not be at a company where there's a sense of camaraderie and you don't feel comfortable in your own skin at your own company. And you don't have a leader who's treating you as an apprentice. Like, who cares if you're having fun if from 9 to 5 you don't like your job. So it's recommended to look for the preferences that I shared, in terms of, you know, impact, camaraderie, and a leader. So, of course, like I said, that's easy for me to say because I was in New Orleans and I had a ball, both in terms of like the general New Orleans having fun, but also digging into the culture, the food, the community, nature, the region. Very rich living experience, but it's about the job first. Because I had friends that were in New Orleans having fun and left because they didn't have the startup experience that they wanted. We're over on time, and I want to respect y'all's Tuesday. Really appreciate y'all taking an hour to chat with us. I know we started a little bit late. I will send a recording out of this webinar. If you got any questions, let them via email. Like I shared, my email is the letter J, the letter R, at ventureforamerica.org. Taking my recruiter hat off and my fellow hat on, I'm a fellow first. And you can notice that I'm pretty informal and casual, and that's because I want to be accessible to y'all. So if there's any way that I can help you, the fact that you want to join my community, I want you to join my community. And if there's anything in the way based on your identity or your socioeconomic situation, please be transparent about that so we can speak to that, because we want to be an on-ramp to entrepreneurship, not just for folks who traditionally are entrepreneurs and in tech, but for any recent grad that wants to become a startup leader and a founder. So let us know what we can do to help. Look forward to connecting with y'all and seeing y'all in person. Have a great Tuesday.